Excellent. All right, so we're live. A bit of a delay starting there. And that's because, all right, so for those of you listening on the podcast uh, through the usual distribution, I'm actually starting to live stream. So I'm now looking at the camera and I am experimenting for the next few episodes with this idea of live streaming on YouTube uh, the recording of each podcast episode. So if you're watching this live on YouTube, hello. And if you're listening to this as a follow-up on the podcast, you can always go and check out the YouTube channel and see the video. It'll be the same content, but there are other videos on the channel that are pretty good. So I'm hoping that this is a different distribution mechanism. There's different preferences, right? Some people like YouTube more than a podcast, so I'm just seeing which works and what's the best way to get this out. I'm every once in a while going to stop talking and just kind of stare at the camera because it's a bit unsettling to see that live button. But there you go. Other than that, I'm going to try and keep this feeling just as if it were a normal podcast. Get my notes. Here we go. All right. So actually, before I get into the content, the other thing I'm doing now for the podcast and also for just the ZenGlop in general is that I've started to send out a newsletter. I'm using email, and I think we're sort of seeing a pendulum switch. Maybe a few years ago, email was considered really old-fashioned and not particularly useful, and my email inbox is filled with junk and spam and all that kind of stuff. But it is also true that the level of engagement with an email feels different from the Facebook engagement. I like what's happening on Facebook. Like my Composer page is slowly but surely accumulating an audience, and I appreciate that. I like to know that there are people listening. But Facebook is weird, right? And I don't. I'm just going to try some different distribution methods, right? So YouTube is one. Audience on YouTube is always really engaged in comments and in feedback. Podcasting is sort of my first true love. I think the format and the medium is. I just love it. I love everything about podcasting. I love listening to podcasts. I love making a podcast. I like the way that it can be. You can have an entirely scripted type of show on a podcast, or you can have very loose dialogue and conversation in podcasts. I really like podcasts. But I think the email, when I look and see, I do get email subscriptions from different news outlets or writers, and I read them. And I often click through from an email in a way that I don't necessarily do if I see a Facebook post. So I'm sort of returning to the idea of blog posting and an email summary weekly-ish, once every week or so, an email with some content and links to the latest podcast episode and some summary of the blog. So I'm guessing that if you're listening to this now, you're probably already on the list of people who are getting that newsletter, because I'm trying to expand out beyond that. And so your mission, your homework, if you choose to accept it, is to think through, if you like this stuff and if you find it interesting, are there two other people that you think might also like it? And could you forward the link to my blog or forward the newsletter and suggest that those people also start to subscribe? So we'll see. It's kind of a 2019 goal to experiment with different distribution and different medium. All right, so that's the mechanics out of the way. It does still seem to be live. That's good. So today I'm going to talk about the Chod practice, and my efforts to memorize the Chod practice, why I think that's important, how I've been approaching it, some of the experiences and realizations that I've had around that Chod practice. So I've talked about Chod, that's spelled C-H-O-D, with some kind of accent over the O. I've talked about that in a number of podcasts along the way. It's part of the meditation practice that I've studied for, 5, 10, a long time. Let's say between 5 and 10 years, and the Chod practice specifically for about 5 years. So, Chod is part of the Tibetan Bon tradition, and it is a self-contained set of practices. There's a series of chants that together make up the Chod practice, and each of those chants fills a formal role or structures the chant from beginning to end. But within it all is the Bodhisattva teaching, the teaching of compassion, the Chodpa, the practitioner of Chod. The fruition of the practice is the compassionate being. But to get there, the Chod practice allows the practitioner to carve away the karmic obligations and obscurations that prevent clarity of mind. So at the center of the Chod practice are these two feasts, the red feast and the white feast. And each of the chants within the Chod practice has a very vivid set of images that are described in the text as you chant them. And part of the practice is to maintain that visualization while you're chanting. And the white feast, the red feast at the center of it, the visualization, I would summarize it as sort of the ritual dismemberment of your own body. And then in the first feast, it is the body is distilled into this nectar that is offered to the tutelar deities and represents sort of the heart essence of your being offered. And then in the second, more viscerally dismembered and then offered as a sacrifice to the demons and obscuration. So between the two of them, you have this sort of karmic cleansing engine. When I've talked about this or taught this, I'm very aware of this image at the center of the practice. It's like these pistons up and down. You throw yourself in. It's kind of like a car wash, sort of churning away with the red feast and the white feast, and the white feast and the red feast, and that lines up to a common image as many of the other meditation practices begin with this imagery of the channels within the body, sort of, red and white, and then a central word channel. And I feel very much like these two feasts fit in the center of the body, and the practitioner becomes very stationary within this liturgical ritual structure that the other chants have formed around those two feasts. So it starts with a chant called the Wild Dance, which in itself is a practice. You could take that one chant and do nothing but meditate on the imagery within that, the sort of the flow of energy within the cosmos and the roar of compassion within that. And then at the very end, there is an offering, the gifts of Bon of wisdom and compassion. So along the way, I'm just going to, if I run through the order of the chants, now I like to think of it as centered on those two feasts, but the ordering of the chants, you start with the Wild Dance, and then there's a couple of standard chants for generating the heart mind of compassion and taking refuge. It's built into the Chod practice with its own form of those chants, focused on the deity, the Kini Kuntujangwa, who's the tutelar deity of the Chod practice, and also one of the manifestations of the mother goddess. Then you have a chant to the dakinis. And a dakini is kind of an emanation, if you're familiar with green tar from a slightly different Tibetan tradition, or the idea of this chorus of saints or angels or semi-divine beings that emanate from that central mother image. Each of the dakinis is identified by different coloring and different attributes. There's fierce dakinis, there's loving dakinis, protective, healing dakinis. In that prayer to the dakinis, you sort of structure all 16 of them around you in this formal pattern. And you can think of it as a protective shape or as a focusing shape. And then there's a switch where you transfer consciousness from your own self into of Kuntujango, and the tutelary deity of the Chod practice. And one of the reasons to do that is because then it's difficult for me to do that. But Kuntujango, consciousness from that perspective, could do that. So then you have the two feasts. Then, like I said, then it wraps up with the gift of Bon, wisdom and compassion, and sort of the clarity of the mind, where the thinker, the discursive thought, has been cut from the ego through those two feasts. And then at the end, there is a dedication of merit, which is kind of a sealing in of the practice. So all of those chants form the Chod. When you do the Chod, very complicated physical component, right? Like there's a drum and a bell, which again, I've done some videos on that before, but I'll continue to talk about this over the next few weeks because I'm really focused on it right now. The drum and the bell are foundational sound to the chant. It accompanies all of the chants. And sometimes it's pretty simple, sort of just straightforward tick-tock, tick-tock, tick. But then there are other complicated patterns that need to be played interspersed throughout the different chants. And the ability to sit with a quiescent body performing these intricate rhythms with an absolutely still mind, these visualizations in place. That's sort of the a priori requirement for then the experience and realization of the fruition of the practice. Right? So the practice is not being able to do the practice is like the cost, the table stakes, right? It's the ante to get in. I've been doing this for 5 years, and I don't yet have it memorized. I'm often fidgeting. I mean, it's not straightforward to get. I say basic, it doesn't mean it's easy. Right? But you need to imagine then the requirements of a stable physical posture that allows you to manage these complicated rhythms while you're also then repeating a chant and holding, and all at the same time, not being attached to any particular outcome from the performance or the practice of the chant. So the whole thing takes roughly 15 minutes, not quite 50 minutes, but more than 10, depending on the variations of each day. But let's say 15 minutes to do the Chod. And typically, when I practice it here, just off camera is my meditation cushion and a small area where I keep a little statue of the Buddha and some images and a few other artifacts that help. Part of the practice of the Chod, in one of the early stages, is if you are trying to cut your ego and disassociate or to break the discursive thought and the associations with the ego, it helps it actually in some ways if that ego is really, really present. And one of the ways that it can be made really present is through fear. And the ego fears its death, and it fears the reminder of its mortality. So if there are images in the Chod of the body is already a corpse that we are carrying with us, well, the ego doesn't like that. I don't like it. What's to like? Jeez. mean, in the other videos I've talked about Chod, I've talked about some of the other attempts I've had to really dig into this practice, and there is an enormous hurdle to really do, like, to you really think about what this practice is about. And I mean, no wonder it's difficult, because it's just bloody terrifying. But okay, so traditionally, when the student had mastered the practice, meaning they could do what I said, they could sit, they could perform it with a stable body, clear visualization, unattached results, then they were instructed to wander the nation or wander the land for however long it took, maybe 108 days, and do the practice in different charnel grounds, 108 charnel grounds. The charnel grounds in Tibet, one of the ways of burial was to leave the corpse out after it had been dismembered and allow the carrion birds to. And in fact, I mentioned the drum and the bell. The third instrument associated with the Chod is this trumpet, the kanling. That was me. On the podcast, you can't see me. I'm imitating. I'm holding the trumpet. I don't have it with me here. But you blow, and you blow 3 times at the start. But the trumpet is traditionally made from human thigh bone. So the practitioner would take the practical grounds, because those places are terrifying for the ego and for the person. They are a brutal and potentially grotesque reminder of the mortality of the will. And so you approach there with sort of this strong assertion, and then perform the practice in the charnel ground, confronting, raising the fear up, calling forth the fear, and then confronting it directly with this practice of compassion. So now in America, now in 2018, about to enter 2019, our graveyards are actually some of the more serene and beautiful places, particularly here in Pittsburgh, in the city, where the graveyards are well maintained. They are landscaped. They are. We're Bronte-esque Yorkshire moor with howling winds and squawking crows, barren lightning blasted oak trees. They're actually some of the more beautiful, pretty parts of the city. It's harder for me to do Chod in my own front yard, where I'm on the edge of a very busy road. Again, I've talked about this before, but the embarrassment of doing this in my own front yard is great enough that I don't do it. So when I talk about table stakes, I can't even get over my own embarrassment, let alone my own confrontation with mortality. So this put me recently. So recently I've been traveling a lot to I don't like going to New York, because I don't really know anything about the city, and I don't explore it. I don't make the effort to go out after work and eat at a restaurant. I'll go to the Whole Foods and get a salad, or I might stop at a Pret-a-Manger or a Au Bon Pain or something and eat in my hotel room. And partly that's because I'm not there on vacation. I'm there, I land, I get an early morning flight on Monday, work a full day, Monday evening, it's 8 o'clock, I'm tired, I don't want to do anything. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I'm just trying to keep my shit together. I'm just trying to, I'm not at home, I don't want to be disoriented. I don't want to just come back to my hotel room and drink a bottle of booze and watch stupid TV. So the last month or so, and for the next month or so, I'm going to be there a lot. And I made a point of saying, okay, I'm going to make the most of this opportunity. And I'm going to, in the evenings that I'm there, I'm going to finally memorize the Chod practice. And I'm going to do that by practicing it twice each evening. So about half an hour, go through. And if they're, just go line by line, and when I stumble, stop, work through what I'm not remembering, and then keep going. And day over day, gradually, I would say that now I have the whole thing memorized, except that there are some lines in the White Feast that are so similar and repeat, but they're not quite the same, that I just keep getting them wrong. And here's one of the things that's interesting about memorizing Chod. I mean, on one hand, it's imagery and poetry, and when I memorize poetry written in English, one of the ways to memorize poetry is actually to allow my mind to freeform associate ridiculous images with the images of the poems, and they become. This is not my technique. This is the memory palace technique, right? If you've got a series of lines that are talking about anything, but you remember them as a plant in the garden or some ridiculous combination of images. As soon as you remember that, you will remember the other line, the real line, and it's true. It's how I remember the poetry that I do memorize. The application of non-essential, non-related, absurd imagery on top of the imagery within the poem is how you memorize poetry. But I can't, and so you would think, okay, so Chod is nothing but images, but I don't know Tibetan, and on top of that, it's not even really a translation. It's an alliteration in Tibetan. It's a lot of syllables, thirds and charts and chads and drogs and dods and nams and nams and dams and dims and doms, and there's no way to associate an image to those words other than the image that's already there, and it doesn't help me memorize it. What does help me memorize it is this sort of tonal pattern, and I think of it as the duck duck moose. Okay, so there's a game, or I think it's a children's game, Duck Duck Goose, or it's a nursery rhyme. I actually don't know the nursery rhyme, but I did once in Maine see a T-shirt that said Duck Duck Moose. It's very funny, and it's even funnier if you know that it should be Duck Duck Goose. Duck Duck Moose. Now, what I have found that within the Chod, the first lines of many of the chants are sort of related, like Duck Duck Goose. They're like Den Dug Med Nug. And I find that if I've got the first couple of syllables, then the rest of the lines, a physical, like a muscle memory takes it, which isn't great, because that part requires constant repetition. But if I can align the sort of tonal sequence with the actual chant, then I can memorize the text. Right? So instead of having this quasi-absurd visual cue, I have this sort of tonal sequence that helps me do. So I've got that, and so let's say then this past week I thought I'm not going to sit in the room and do this. It's nice sitting in the room, particularly because where my office is located and where the hotels that I typically stay in all look out right over the World Trade Center, and if I'm in one of the higher up rooms with a big glass window, I can sit, and there's sort of this de facto big sky effect, right? I'm up there, I feel like I'm floating above the city, surrounded by this crystal object that's keeping me suspended far above the ground, and then there's nothing but these shining lights and shimmering towers far off in the distance. It's actually quite beautiful. But I thought, when I do that, I have the text in front of me, and I've got my eyes closed, and I'm not looking, but I always know that if I stumble, I can look down and find the text. I thought, what I'm going to do is just leave the text at home and walk out and go down to the river. Honestly, it's about a 3-minute walk to go down to I guess it's the Hudson. And then I said I'll do it twice still, but I'm going to walk. I'm not going to take the drum and the bell and all that not rigmarole nonsense, but I'm going to chant out loud, quietly, under my breath, up and down the river, twice, and then just see, where do I really stumble? And boy, does it make it real. I mean, the first time I did that, I realized, I've really got to pay attention here, and it's hard to pay attention because the river is enormous. I mean, we have two rivers here in Pittsburgh, and a third that starts, and we think they're big, but they're, the Hudson, has this enormous swell to it. I'm walking along on this beautiful pathway that goes all the way up and down. And on the other side of the river is some other part of some city. I guess it's New Jersey by then, or maybe it's Brooklyn. I don't know. Yeah, I really don't know. Some other big part of some other city. And there's lots of river traffic. There's ferries going back and forth. And there's Coast Guard. There's cruise ships, big cruise ships that go up and down. And it's intoxicating. I mean, the river it just has this swell to it. And when I'm in the middle of the chant, there's this sort of awareness of falling into the river, which is part fear, and then the fear of falling and the fear of drowning, always mixed with the urge to do it and see what it feels like. So walk up and down there. So I did that 3 nights, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday last week. And as I walk out, I'm walking towards the Statue of Liberty. So I see this, it's right there. It's still far from the distance, so she's quite small still. When I tried to take pictures with my phone, it's just this sort of tiny little green smear in the background. But at one point, I felt very strongly that when the Dakini prayer is being offered, when I'm chanting the prayer to the Dakinis, the Statue of Liberty, the Lady Liberty, is a manifestation of one of those Dakini energies. I mean, and I felt, wow, man, like they're really real. Yeah, there are hundreds, thousands of people practicing Chod right here on the banks of the river, the Hudson River, maybe, right now, and always have been. And Lady Liberty is the sort of the first precipitation of Dakini energy. And if we just keep doing it, we'll get more and more of that sort of beautiful, healing, protective, generous, compassion energy shining out, literally shining out in the middle of the fucking ocean. It's beautiful. Thousands of us. Or at least, but at least I know that for those 3 days there was one person doing Chod. Because I was. And the memorization, right? I mean, I stumble in the places I know I'm going to stumble because it's hard. And so then I write down in my notebook, just keep figuring out what's the tonal sequence. So I feel like, a couple more weeks of really focusing like that, and then I'll have that practice. Now, the last night I was there last week, it's a Thursday night. I came back on Friday night, and I'm actually back up there tomorrow, so we'll see. But I found that there's this weird little parklet that actually goes out over the river. I'm not sure what it was originally. This whole area has obviously been gentrified and renovated from some previous industrial past now into this very elaborate residential office mixed-use space. And it could have been a drainage someplace. It's quite large, maybe, I don't know, 30 yards circular. You can walk around this thing, but in the middle of it is the river. I mean, it's into this sort of pool, like a tidal pool type of thing. And then there's this weird bridge that someone built that goes up above it, and there's a bench at the top. So I sat up there. This was another place where I just felt like I was supported and floating doing this practice. But here's what happens. Every time one of the boats, big boats would go by and cause a wake, the wake would kind of get channeled into this park, and this enormous roar would come up. And it really was like disorienting and discombobulating, and dissecting, and dissolving. Like I really had to hold my shit together. It was a lesson in the importance of the essential foundational stability that's required to really do this practice. Because what if this was the last moment, and I was experiencing rainbow body or dying? My physical strength was evaporating, and I couldn't hold my shit together. So these are moments where it's important and useful to practice that. Like, hold your shit together. You're doing this stuff. Yeah. So anyway, that's probably a pretty good place to stop with that. Let me just check my notes. I did want to point out, I'm holding up on the camera, I've got this little leather notebook that has two smaller notebooks in it. And one of the things that I've talked about before, but I'm just going to stress again, the importance of having a constant feedback loop with yourself on paper. I'm holding up on camera here. You can see notes. These really are just the drippings of my brain. They don't mean anything. It's not a journal. It's not a diary. It's just whatever. If something feels like it needs to be written down, I'm going to write it down in this notebook. And I'm loving this particular edition of the field notes for the East Coast. The paper is extraordinary. It's a little bit heavier than most of them. And I love they've got this sort of half grid on it. It's really nice. Then the other notebook that I've got here is the memory of, or the recollection of the dry trump. So since January 1st, 2017, so coming on 2 years now, every day I've noted whether I drank or not and how many push-ups I did. That has been consistent because if you recall, the core of the dry trump was 100 push-ups a day, 10,000 steps a day, no drinking, and that was it. Now along the way I've added in records of, did I do Chod, have I done Poa practice, and I've kept sort of a high level record of the practices that I've done. And I certainly haven't stayed sober every day or done push-ups every day. But 2019 is the start of this will then be the third year of the dry trump. So I think there's going to be something that I need to think about. Exactly what does that mean now? I mean, if it's just keeping a record, that's one thing. But are there goals or targets? Like originally it was no drinking until that motherfucker, no drinking until Donald Trump wasn't president anymore. Clearly that's not what it is now. But there is a real consistency between periods of 10 days or more where I don't drink, and then my artistic or creative output. That's really clear, written down here, that connection. So some of these foundational basic tasks I think are useful. So I would encourage everyone to get a little notebook and a pen. And these field notes are perfect size. You can throw them right in your pocket. Okay, going to wrap it up. It looks like the live stream has continued to work, which is excellent. And I'm going to drop this up on YouTube immediately after this, and then put it up on iTunes for the podcast. So again, remember your homework. Find 2 people who you think will like this in the show notes for both the video and the the podcast. I'm going to put a link to sign up for the newsletter. I really want to focus on that, because I'm focusing on the distribution for the podcast, this content. And if you have any questions, use the comments, line them up, and we'll go from there. So, groovy. Thanks, everyone. Keep your wits about you, and I will talk to you next week.